HMS General Wolfe was one of 8 12-inch gun monitors built for the Royal Navy in 1915, having spare 12-inch guns from older pre-dreadnoughts that were of limited value. General Wolfe and her sisters were constructed after the relative ease and speed at which the 14-inch gun monitors were constructed. It also helped that the First Lord of the Admiralty was Winston Churchill, and the First Sea Lord of the Admiralty was Jackie Fisher, as both had and would go on to have some rather interesting ideas, with Churchill's bombardment of the Dardanelles and further campaigns there. Not to mention Admiral Fisher's Baltic project, in which the use of these monitors would be crucial. So, General Wolfe, upon completion in 1915, was used in various bombardment roles up and down the English Channel as part of the Dover Patrol, even being part of the raids on Ostend and Zeebrugge. But what she is best known for is a rather large modification of a single 18-inch gun, one of the largest guns ever fitted to a Royal Navy warship. This gun was from the rather small and heavily armed battlecruiser, which Fisher, for political purposes, described as a large light cruiser, HMS Furious, which was having her own interesting reconstructions. This modification came late in the war, and unlike HMS Lord Clive, whom we have previously discussed, General Wolfe did get to use that 18-inch gun a bit more. After the war, she was laid up and scrapped in 1923. The idea of a small warship with a big gun in a shallow draft was a concept that can be roughly traced back to the Age of Sail, when British and French forces used bomb vessels at the end of the 17th century to bombard forts at places like Tripoli and Genoa. These vessels came into being for the Royal Navy in the 1690s, as Jim Crosley in Monitors of the Royal Navy, How the Fleet Brought the Great Guns to Bear writes, "The offender was the bomb ketch, a vessel copied from the French. Bomb ketches were small, shallow draft ships able to get close inshore. They were armed with a dastardly weapon, a large-bore mortar, which threw an explosive bomb far up in the air so that it cleared the walls of wharfside cities or harbors and exploded when it struck the ground, damaging property, killing soldiers and civilians alike. In the Iron and Steam Age, these vessels came to be in the Crimean War, and especially the American Civil War. With this in mind, in the stalemate of the First World War, the Admiralty in November 1914, now under the control of Admiral Jackie Fisher as the First Sea Lord and Winston Churchill as the First Lord, desired to find a way to break the stalemate that had already set in using the Grand Fleet. They wanted to strike Germany decisively in a vulnerable spot. As I mentioned in the introduction, Fisher had been a proponent of his Baltic project, where an offensive against the Pomeranian coast could enable a landing with Russian support only 90 miles from Berlin. For this to occur, the High Seas Fleet would need to be decisively neutralized or locked up in Wilhelmshaven. Not only that, the shallow water of the Baltic enabled it to be easily mined, meaning that the big gun battleships with their deep drafts would be at risk in such operations. The stabilization of the Western Front also offered possibilities to land in the Low Countries against German positions. Another important factor that contributed to the development of monitors was the situation in the Mediterranean with the German battlecruiser Goeben and the cruiser Breslau, as they had sought refuge in the Ottoman Empire after bombarding French positions in North Africa and being chased by Royal Navy ships into the Eastern Mediterranean, something I discuss in a video on Indefatigable. The Ottomans were still deciding whether they were going to join the Central Powers. With Goeben and Breslau in the Ottoman Empire, there were opportunities to open up the Dardanelles to get supplies and materials to Russia, and with the failure of the Royal Navy to catch those 2 German ships, there were those who wanted to avenge that failure. The Dardanelles Straits leading to Constantinople were narrow, shallow, defended by guns, could be easily mined, and quite frankly, no place for the big gun battleships the Allies, and specifically the Royal Navy, would need to send to control the straits. Britain did not have the ships to effectively and somewhat safely reach enemy strongpoints and strong shore defenses. What Britain did have were a lot of big guns from obsolete pre-dreadnoughts and/or ships that did not need them anymore. An interesting point in the development of Royal Navy monitors is in November 1914, when Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steelworks, was on RMS Olympic and witnessed the sinking of HMS Audacious. Schwab was there to sell arms to Britain. Once Admiral John Jellicoe, the commander-in-chief of the Grand Fleet, had released him and the other passengers, he went on to London and talked to the First Lord, Winston Churchill, where he offered to sell him the 14-inch guns Bethlehem Steelworks was building for the Greek battleship Salamis in Germany. As long as the British blockade withstood, Schwab was perfectly content to sell them to Churchill, and the idea of the first British monitors was conceived. These were the monitors Abercrombie, Havelock, Raglan, and Roberts, not to be confused with the one from the Second World War. To quote Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945 by Ian Buxton, by the standards of Ericsson's original design, the British concept was not strictly a monitor, but over the intervening half-century, the term could reasonably be considered as having evolved somewhat to embrace a new type, which still owed something of its characteristics to the first monitor. Within the Royal Navy, the description monitor would be distinctive and unambiguous, while not giving away too much as to their expected operational role. The Royal Navy first constructed those four 14-inch gun monitors. Once realizing the rapidity which the construction of those 14-inch monitors got underway, and with the coastal bombardment opportunities I had mentioned before, including the Dardanelles as the Ottomans had entered the war, it encouraged Churchill to plan further big gun monitors, telling Fisher about reserve 13.5-inch guns meant for Audacious, as well as reserve 15-inch and 18-inch howitzers. Where taking from Buxton, we can read a letter sent to the Secretary of the Admiralty because it's very interesting and something that's very Churchill. We ought, without delay, to order more Styx class for heavy inshore work. There are, for instance, the four reserve 13.5-inch guns of the Audacious, which should certainly be mounted in new monitors. It should also be possible to draw from the reserve of 15-inch guns and to make in short time 15-inch or 18-inch howitzers. We require now to make ships which can be built in 6 or 7 months at the outside, and which can certainly go close in ashore and attack the German fleet in its harbors. These are special vessels built for a definite war operation, and we must look to them in default of a general action for giving us the power of forcing a naval decision at the latest in autumn of 1915. Our thought is proceeding independently on the same lines. I propose, as a basis of discussion, that in addition to the 4 Schwab monitors, we prepare 8 more at the cost of no more than £700,000 apiece. These vessels should be armed with either the 13.5-inch or 15-inch guns, 2 or 4 in each as convenient. Alternatively, they should be armed with 4 18-inch howitzers in separate cupolas sunk low on their heavily armored turtlebacks. They should draw 8 feet at the most and be propelled entirely by internal combustion at a speed not exceeding 10 knots. No funnels. 3 or 4 alternative telescopic masts for fire observation. Strong crinolines 20 away all around to make them immune from mine and torpedo, etc. A third alternative variant would be 2 heavy guns and turrets in the center and 2 mortars and cupola pits on each side of the deck. Churchill hoped to have more out by the autumn of 1915. After roping in Fisher and the 3rd Sea Lord, they found the spare 13.5-inch and spare 15-inch guns. However, these weren't practical as they were better off with the battleships and battle cruisers. Another possibility laid open, taking the mountings from existing ships. As many of you know, and as I previously stated, Britain had a lot of older pre-dreadnoughts, who carried 4 12-inch guns apiece and were now of limited value, the oldest of which were the 9 of the Majestic class designed in 1893. So it was proposed that 4 of the ships would have their 12-inch 35 caliber guns dismounted, and with that, 8 new monitors could be armed. Some modifications to the elevation of the guns were needed, and within a day, the necessary modifications to the design were complete, and the 13.5-inch degree elevation was quickly modified to 30 degrees, and over 21,000 yards of range could be achieved by the guns. The ship's design was little changed from the previous 14-inch gun monitors, having a draft of 10 feet and 15-foot bulges. If you want to talk about bulges, these are bulges. If you thought the ex-Norwegian coastal defense ships Glatten and Gorgon looked funny, these are awesome. Anyway, it was hoped the machinery could be diesel, but that type of machinery was still in its infancy, and so not practical. Interestingly enough, the Roberts built in the Second World War was also considered for diesel. Still, for similar reasons, it was not practical, as they needed to get the ship out as quickly as possible. Instead, these 12-inch monitors received steam reciprocators, giving them around 2,000 shaft horsepower, with steam provided by 2 boilers, and a top speed a little under 10 knots. Since the armament was 367 tons lighter than the 14-inch guns, the hull could be made slightly narrower, also simplifying the issue of berthing these odd ships. And more important for the crew, the thickness of the sloping armor belt increased from 4 inches to 6 inches, resulting in a displacement of 5,600 tons as compared to the almost 6,000 tons of the earlier class. As you can see from this picture, the ships were pretty sparse, with only the main battery and a few smaller guns that were added on. The tripod mast, funnel, and other fittings on the forecastle deck, which ran 3/4 of the length of the ship. The aft section being open, providing a space to arrange for the stowage for observation seaplanes, making monitors one of the first ships designed from the outset to carry aircraft. The upper deck was open at the sides, containing the galleys and wash places, together with the barbette structure surrounding the ammunition trunk to the turret. The lower decks were where the coal bunkers and machinery spaces were, magazine spaces, and the accommodation for the crew, which was about 200 men and not exactly roomy. After working out who was going to build the ships and changes to their machinery to triple expansion engines, the 8 ships of the class began to be laid down, being named for British generals, with the names being, of course, General Wolfe, Sir John Moore, General Crawford, Earl of Peterborough, Prince Rupert, Prince Eugene, Sir Thomas Picton, and Lord Clive. Once in service, their deep load displacement was around 5,850 tons, and they were given anti-aircraft guns, which were the smaller ones seen on their decks. Something interesting I didn't mention in the video on Lord Clive is which battleship each of the monitors got their guns from. Well, Lord Clive got her guns from the battleship Magnificent, and General Wolfe the battleship Victorious, while the others got them from either of those 2 ships or HMS Hannibal or HMS Mars. It really is impossible to beat Royal Navy naming conventions. Anyway, a majority of the class were directed towards the Dover Squadron in the summer of 1915. Churchill identified the U-boat base near Zeebrugge as the first bombardment target for the new monitors. The other 12-inch monitors had several bombardments of the Belgian coast under their belt before General Wolfe was finally ready for service on November 12, 1915, when she finally arrived at Dover to join the rest of the Dover Patrol, bringing the squadron up to 6 12-inch monitors and 2 15-inch monitors, plus 4 other ones. By the time Wolfe joined, operations in the English Channel were shutting down for the time being because the weather was turning. However, all the monitors besides General Wolfe were ordered to the Thames estuary to try to intercept German airships from attacking London, with Buxton writing, "The intention was for the small monitors to fix the airships and their searchlights, while the large monitors fired 12-inch shrapnel at maximum elevation so that lead balls might fall on the airship. However, given the lack of any form of high-angle fire control, even getting close to such a moving target was difficult. In the event, the few airships sighted were far out of range." Next, in late January, Marshal Foch requested a demonstration of force to support army operations, meaning it was time for the monitors, including General Wolfe, to get into action once again. With some extra help for spotting, as they had newly developed air spotting procedures, General Wolfe, Lord Clive, General Crawford, Prince Eugene, Marshal Ney, M25 and M27 proceeded to West End for another bombardment mission. The ships fired in rotation so that shells could land at roughly 20-second intervals, thus permitting corrections to be signaled to the ship. This was quite effective. The bombardment allowed each monitor to fire 11 rounds before leaving, encountering little response from the German shore batteries. This proved to be the last bombardment for 7 months, wherein they were refit, with some receiving 6-inch guns to strengthen their anti-destroyer defenses, and other operations like guarding the channel against German incursion, where they proved to be very capable of doing so, and soon the German destroyers learned to fear the sound of those 12-inch guns, retreating upon seeing their flash. One such operation occurred in late April 1916, where General Wolfe and Prince Eugene covered an operation that laid nets fitted with mines, backed by further lines of moored mines. It ran for about 20 miles along the Belgian coast, 12 miles offshore. Wolfe was fired on by the Tirpitz battery from 32,000 yards, in which they straddled the monitor. Wolfe retreated at full speed and got out of range relatively quickly, considering her top speed, only to be attacked by German aircraft. The bombs the aircraft carried were ineffective, and there is a possibility the 12-inch gunfire of General Wolfe scared them off. Later, German torpedo boats came into view and were sent away by British destroyers in the covering fire of Wolfe and Eugene. By July, the monitors were back on the French and Belgian coast, bombarding German batteries. Operations for General Wolfe mostly consisted of anti-destroyer patrols, for a long portion of 1916, so let's move into 1917. Things began to get interesting in December 1917 when General Wolfe, Prince Eugene, and Lord Clive were taken into Portsmouth to take on an 18-inch gun. As you see, the light battlecruiser HMS Furious, originally part of Fisher's Baltic project, to whom these 18-inch guns originally belonged, was going through several refits to make her quite the interesting carrier, with multiple flight decks, something I discuss in a recent video on her, where I think Crosley puts it best. These great guns, the largest ever fitted to British warships, had been built for a new generation of battlecruisers, which were rapidly redesigned as aircraft carriers, making their turrets redundant. Now, something I didn't make clear in my video on Lord Clive is the reason for the addition of an 18-inch gun besides actually testing the thing, where again Crosley gives a succinct explanation of that. The other two found their way onto the monitors, with the idea that they might enable a more effective long-range bombardment of Zeebrugge. Originally, the guns were in revolving turrets on Furious, but mounting that onto a 6,000-ton warship was not practicable without the removal of the 12-inch turret and the rearrangement of the machinery. So, a completely different design was chosen, with the whole mount weighing 384 tons, including the 149-ton gun, and it was nearly doubled when ammunition was on board, presenting even more problems for these little ships. Proposals in the summer of 1917 called for the strengthening of the forecastle deck abaft the funnel to take on the mounting, but leaving the existing armament undisturbed. As there was no room for ammunition below decks, a day's worth of ammunition would have to be kept on the upper decks, with cordite cases on the forecastle deck. A light shield would be placed on the mounting, and so arranged to allow the massive gun to have 45 degrees of elevation. Because they did not want to change the machinery or 12-inch gun, the only place they could put the mounting was abaft the engine room, increasing the draft to 14 feet and reducing the freeboard to 4 feet. By closing up the inboard bulge compartments, which were normally open to the sea, this somewhat fixed it, and the ship now weighed 6,850 tons. The after part of the bulge was fully submerged, increasing the risk of a torpedo riding over and exploding, so heavy metal deflectors were fitted over the bulge. In December, when the three ships were taken in hand, the first two, Lord Clive and Prince Eugene, were partially done in April and returned to service. However, General Wolfe didn't return until August, because she did have her 18-inch gun in her mounting, unlike Lord Clive and Prince Eugene, who would not receive her gun. Wolfe was fitted and ready for trials by August 7th off Isle White, where Buxton gives an interesting explanation of her appearance. General Wolfe's appearance had been substantially altered. The huge box-like shield over the 18-inch gun gave rise to the nickname Elephant and Castle for the ship. The closing in of the sides of the upper deck gave the hull a more business-like appearance. The quarterdeck was considerably cramped by an extra boat, a proper stern anchor, and a windlass, and the extension aft of the forecastle deck. Apart from the two pom-poms on the 18-inch shield, the secondary armament was all concentrated forward. Two 6-inch abreast the bridge, and two 3-inch high-angle guns abreast the 12-inch turret. Smaller changes included installing two 36-inch searchlights aft, replacing the two 24-inch ones on the main mast, a slim main mast to support the wireless aerials, bow defense gear, modified paravanes for the bulge hulls, removal of the armored conning tower, sighting of the 18-inch cordite stowage tanks, and associated rail tracks abaft the funnel on the forecastle deck, a new ammunition derrick on the port side for the 18-inch, and a more substantial bridge structure. Internally, the after half of the upper deck was given over to the 18-inch shell stowage and their transporters, plus the extensive structural supports for the mounting. After returning to service after finishing her trials, it would take some time for her to get to use that 18-inch gun, until late September. The monitors were supporting the advance of Allied armies, comprising British, French, and Belgian soldiers under the command of the Belgian king, King Albert. All of the monitors, excluding Clive and Eugene, were involved in the bombardment on the 28th of September, and something that Buxton comments on is very interesting. General Wolfe's activity is worth describing in some detail, as it is sometimes doubted whether she ever fired her 18-inch gun in action. The gun was fitted in a semi-fixed athwartship mounting projecting over the starboard bulge, capable of only a limited amount of training. It was, therefore, necessary to anchor the ship at bow and stern, broadside on to the target. In the tidal currents off the Belgian coast, this presented some difficulty, so good weather was desirable for accurate shooting. Anyway, at 7:32 that morning, she opened fire from 36,000 yards on the important railway bridge of 4 miles south of Ostend. In doing so, she made naval history, firing the heaviest shell from the biggest gun at the longest range ever used in action to date. Soon, enemy guns returned fire, and even with help from tugs, Wolfe soon had trouble maintaining her position broadside on to wind and tide. Still, her crew managed to keep up their bombardment for nearly 2 hours, and with good effect. Throughout the day, she expended all of her 18-inch ammunition. Crosley writes this about the action. Wolfe's target was a railway bridge at 4 miles inland from Ostend. Wolfe was supported by a small monitor acting as an aiming mark to seaward to give directional orientation, and her director tower had to pass aiming instructions not only to the gun turrets, but also to the capstans controlling the fore and aft anchor change, which gave course direction to the gun. She needed the assistance of tugs to keep her in place as her stern anchor persisted in dragging and the whole ship tried to skid sideways due to the recoil from the great gun. She achieved quite good accuracy, but the bridge was not destroyed. The bombardment carried on for the next 5 days, with Wolfe firing a further 27 18-inch shells. Further bombardments were carried out in October, but those are covered in the video on HMS Lord Clive. The monitors were going to carry out further bombardments in November. Still, with the armistice bringing an end to hostilities, it would bring an end to most of the 12-inch monitors, with Lord Clive being the only one doing anything notable after the war. General Wolfe was laid up at Immingham from the spring of 1919 until the winter of 1920 to 1921, being towed to Portsmouth, where the guns and other useful fittings were stripped, and eventually the ship was scrapped in 1923. I find it interesting that I started my internship with a video on HMS Lord Clive, and finished it with one of her sisters. I want to say that my internship was extremely successful, and that I've accepted a full-time position for when I'm done with school. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help my channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.